friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Hello, and thank you for joining the Rewind podcast. I am here with Pastor Kirk and Pastor Daryl. Say hey.
Hey, Blair.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm Blair Hicks, your host, and we are starting a new series.
We are.
And well, I mean, we already started it, and now we are podcasting about it. The series is called, probably should have written that down.
Is that what we're doing today? We're podcasting about the series that we started?
Well, yeah. I mean, what's the name of it, Kirk?
Core Values.
Core Values. Because I have the name of the actual message was A Church Led by Jesus. And you both started your messages kind of talking about, don't worry, I have a question to ask before we dive too quickly in because I don't want to give you guys whiplash. But you did talk about how this is what this series is about. It's not like, hey, we're Forward Church, roar, or whatever.
Definitely not that.
No. It is, and you were very clear about...
First of all, if I was to say, this is Forward Church, roar, I wouldn't say it like, hey, we're Forward Church, roar.
Well, I think it's because if you said that at the front, I'd be like, no, I'm not going to do that, Kirk. No, it could be misconstrued, but it's actually a very awesome series that I am excited about. I know you guys are too. This week's message was A Church Led by Jesus. You kind of talked, Kirk, at the beginning about sort of like the most amazing thing that you've ever seen.
Yeah.
Was that, and you probably didn't hear Kirk's message, but I
haven't. No, not yet.
What was the reason for asking it again? I can't remember. It was something like...
Well, at that point, I was talking about Jesus, and I was talking about how, in the passage we were in, it was talking about how Jesus is preeminent.
Yes.
And the whole point was simply, when we see something amazing, we are forced, as humans, we feel compelled to stop.
Yes.
And to just, whether it's stand in amazement of it or just soak it all in, we're just overwhelmed by whatever it is that we're seeing, right? Like you don't rush past things that make you feel in awe. And, when it comes to Jesus, what I really want and was hoping for people to come out of this passage with was just be in awe of who Jesus is. Like take a moment to just don't rush past everything about Jesus, but just be in awe of who he is.
So then I loved that because as soon as you started talking about that, it went immediately into my head going, what's the most amazing thing I've ever seen?
Yeah, what is the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?
It's going to sound cliche, but when my daughter was born and they put her on me and I was just like, holy moly, there is a human being and she's here and I was waiting for her and now she's here and I'm not pregnant anymore.
In that order, right?
Until a year and a little bit later, I was like, oh. Anyway, but no, that was, you never are ready for that, for sure. Yeah. So that was my answer, probably. I'm dying to know what yours are. You can't say the same answer as me with your own kids, by the way. I already took that one.
So the most amazing thing was when... So I'm not going to talk about my kids, but Steph giving birth.
Oh.
So there you go. Subverted that of just how amazing she was in that moment and how terrifying that moment was. That awe and terror all wrapped in together. But you kind of already claimed that one, so I'll say another one.
Okay.
When I moved out west and went to the Rocky Mountains for the first time.
Yeah.
And just driving through the mountains, driving off to Banff, and just smiling from ear to ear. I'm like, this is just what an amazing sight. Just being surrounded by those mountains and just the beauty of that. That was pretty cool.
And that's interesting because you have admitted in the past that you are not an outdoorsy person.
No, I was in the car though. Air conditioning,
you don't
music's
have to.
playing.
That explains a lot.
You can stay in the car.
I don't want to go out there. I want to be in the car. No. I love going off to Banff. you go to a nice restaurant and you're sitting there on the patio and you're just enjoying just all the beauty. At the patio, though.
Yeah.
Like, you're not, like, I'm not going to climb those things. I just want to enjoy it from down here.
I just appreciate the honesty. You know who you are, Daryl, and you're just like, that's what it is. What is the most amazing thing you've ever seen?
I don't know if I can narrow it down. I don't
You
know if
can
I can
pick
narrow it down.
one. Just name a good one then.
Well, okay, so you guys already kind of claimed my top two.
Really? Is it Banff or like the Rocky Mountains? Like, is that?
It would be Moraine Lake out near Banff.
Okay.
And watching our kids be born.
Yeah.
Like, there's a few things that top that.
Yeah.
What else? Seeing the Grand Canyon.
I've heard that from more than one person.
It is pretty.
I got to put it in there.
It is. Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah.
Your mind cannot comprehend the Grand Canyon. Even when you see it, you're like, this isn't real.
Wow.
And the other one, I'm a little bit geeky on this one. I love outer space stuff. Like, I love space exploration.
Yeah.
So watching the first time that a SpaceX rocket tried to land itself was fascinating to me. Like, watching a SpaceX rocket go up and then propel, whatever they call it, into space, and then turn around and land itself back on the ground. Shannon would tell you, I'd be sitting there watching the video with the biggest smile on my face, just admiring.
It was video.
Yeah, it was video. I wasn't there live, but it just, like, I'm in awe of any of that kind of stuff. And nature, so many things in nature put me in awe. I have a very long list of things that I really love.
I wouldn't say that's geeky. Maybe Mr. Calling is like an engineer. If this ever doesn't work out, the path stringing thing.
It's the Star Trek in me.
Oh, then that's geeky. I take it back. That's definitely geeky. Oh, what a good opening question. We could probably keep talking about it, but I will rein us in. Although I will say I've never been to Banff and I've never been to the Grand Canyon. Derek almost had a coronary and asked and questioned my Canadian citizenship when I said I'd never been to Banff.
Yeah, you need to go to Banff.
All right.
You need to get Steve. Steve, this is a word from your pastors.
Yeah.
Take your wife and your kids to Banff.
Yeah.
Honestly, flights out there are not that expensive. Like, it's pretty.
Do you want to babysit?
Get some budget. Get a budget airline. That's all I'll say. Like,
okay.
And I feel very strongly that every Canadian should at least once in their life drive across the country.
Oh, that's a lot of
drive
driving.
across the country.
Yeah, drive across the country.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think at least once it is like a. And because we kind of live in the somewhat middle of the country, like, you almost have to do 2 trips. You got to do like 1 year where you go west and you loop back around home, and 1 year where you go east and you loop back around home.
All right. So does it count? I mean, I drove from Ontario through the States up to Alberta. Does that count as across Canada?
Nope.
No. Oh,
you got to experience those prairie skies, as boring of a drive as it is, through Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
Oh, I drove through Saskatchewan for a good amount of time.
It's a terrible experience.
It really is.
You're really selling this.
But
for
like
sure.
that 3-day drive from here out west was amazing.
Yeah.
I love that. That was so much fun. It was just me, all my belongings that I have.
Yeah.
In the 2001 Sunfire, driving out there to start a new career, and that was so much fun.
Right on.
Had no plan.
Yep.
Just had my GPS.
Yep.
Didn't know where I was going to spend that night. I'm just going to drive until I can't drive anymore.
Shannon and I love doing
lots of
road
fun.
trips. Road trips are amazing.
Yeah.
Not my jam.
Yeah.
I don't like being stuck in a car for a long time. That's another thing that Derek makes fun of me about.
Wait, define a long time?
Well, we went out east already.
Yeah.
So he's got family there. So we drove about 18 hours to New Brunswick. And while we were there, we did like Nova Scotia, PEI. So we went around. But the 18-hour drive almost killed me. And I was like, I'm not going to do that.
18 hours is a long time.
It's a long
Well, you
time.
don't do it all at once.
Well, we split it up.
That's the whole point of a road trip.
We stopped
You're
in
like
Cornwall.
exploring.
Well, we stopped in Cornwall and then went from Cornwall and kept going. So altogether it was 18 hours, but still he was like, this is so fun. Are you having fun? And I was like, can you just wake me up when we're there? It was, my butt was hurting and you're not even hungry because you're not even expelling any energy because you're just sitting. Anyways.
When I drove out west, I had never driven myself for longer than an hour at a time. And then I jump in the car and I'm going to drive for like 3 days.
Yeah.
Because in Ontario, like where we're at, it's like everything is like an hour away, right?
Yeah,
Like,
you're right.
Like tell me something that I really want to go. Like that's more than like Toronto's an hour, you know, like everything's an hour. So
True. Well, you made it.
there you go.
And then you drove back.
No, I flew back.
You flew back. Good
It was
choice.
the pandemic. They would not let me drive back.
Oh, fair enough.
I was very bummed out that I couldn't drive back.
And you also had a 2-year-old at the time, right?
Yeah, that
so
also
that would
changes
have
it.
been
Yeah.
torture.
Yeah.
We're bringing it back in. Okay. That was a great conversation. Let's continue it after the podcast over a cup of coffee or something. But we're going to bring it back in. Kirk, you kind of gave us a little bit of an overview already when you were talking about how your message was in the hopes of reminding us to just be in awe of Jesus. Not even reminding us, but like giving us like reason and whatnot, taking us into Colossians. Is there anything else you want to elaborate on your overview of the message?
Well, I just want to say that like the whole series is just this idea of all of us have values that we are driven by in life. And so those values determine the decisions you're going to make with your life. And so as a church, we need to have values as well. And I think that what we talked about this past Sunday is the value above all other values. It is the trump card, so to speak. It's the final thing that matters more than anything else we're going to talk. Everything else has to flow out of this value.
Yeah, and so I guess that makes sense as to why it would be the first part of our new series.
Yeah.
Laying the foundation. Daryl, do you have anything? I know you talked about the same thing, but is there anything you wanted to tell us about the main takeaways from your message?
Yeah. So main takeaway, a church led by Jesus. So really the thing I focus on is that if we're going to be truly led by Jesus, then our future is secure and our past is healed.
I love
And
that.
so that's what I want to focus on, is that being led by Jesus leads us into a greater sense of security because how amazing Jesus is, because he is sovereign over everything. And then as we're studying Colossians, like the Apostle Paul, he starts talking about how Jesus is the one who brings healing and reconciliation. And so I love it in verse 21 where he kind of makes this hard right turn. He's talking about who Jesus is and how amazing Jesus is. And then he turns around and he says, and now you. And I love that moment. It's like, oh, no. Now me next to Jesus. He says, and now you need reconciliation. And I really want us to focus in on that, is that if we're being led by Jesus, he actually leads us into healing, that we need to be reconciled, that we need our sins forgiven, that there's stuff in our past that only Jesus can really deal with. And I think until we understand that, I think it's hard for us to be led by Jesus, because we're going to keep on trying to lead ourselves. If we don't feel secure, we're going to try to find our own security. And if we don't feel at peace, if we don't feel that reconciliation, that forgiveness that Jesus has given us, we're going to keep on trying to work for it. We're going to keep on trying to fix the things inside of us. And Jesus is there saying, I'm here to fix these things. I'm the one who is here to lead you. Just place your trust in me.
Yeah, and I guess that connects to your point, Kirk. Once we do understand that and we do grasp that, thus the awe.
Yeah, I mean, there's really, so it talks about Jesus being the head of the church in Colossians chapter 1. And there's really kind of these two meanings of the word head that gets flushed out in Colossians chapter 1. There is this idea of Jesus is the source of everything in our life. And so we have to find our life in him, and everything Daryl just described. That's what that's referring to. Jesus is the source of all of those things for us. And the other meaning of the word head that gets kind of fleshed out is Jesus is king. And which means Jesus gets to set the agenda. Jesus is the one who gets to tell us what success looks like, and we're going to talk a bit about that. Jesus is the one who gets to tell us what the mission is. He's the one who gets to tell us why we do what we do and how we do what we do. He has the final say on everything.
So is that something that stood out to you most in your prep or your study this week? Did you have anything that stood out?
I think the thing that really stood out to me is what Daryl was talking about, just that whole idea of being reconciled to God, and even the use of language like you were alienated and hostile in your minds. And I spent some time really trying to wrestle through that reality of, well, wait a minute, like, no, I wasn't really angry at God. I didn't really think evil of God.
Yeah.
But this verse is telling me that I used to be this way. And
Yeah.
so just spending some time wrestling through thinking about that perspective, and then what does it mean that Jesus reconciles us to God?
Mm-hmm. Was there anything that stood out to you, Derek? Daryl?
Daryl has way too much hair to be
man.
Derek.
Gotta check that it's still there.
I'm gonna call you something else because I think I do that all the time. The does and the anyway. Bro.
I get emails pretty often. Hey, Derek.
Do you?
Yeah, that's the challenge.
We'll call you bro instead. No, we're not gonna do that. Was there anything that stood out to you, Daryl?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
indeed.
Please share.
Really focusing on that verse 15, where it says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of creation, and just kind of wrestled through that for a while of what does that mean? What is this telling us? And we're kind of where I landed was that Jesus is our connection to a meaningful life. If he's the firstborn of creation, that's saying something about us, that Jesus is preeminent before us, and he's the image of God, so he helps us to see God. And so what he is doing, what that's saying is that we need to be able to see God.
Right.
We're unable to do that, so we need Jesus to do these things for us. And the thing that really just stood out to me, Tim Keller I was listening to or reading a book. I was listening to a message which referenced his book. Anyways,
That got confusing.
Tim Keller wrote a book called On Death, where he explains that we're living in the West in the first fully secular culture that has ever existed. There's never been a fully secular culture like we have today. And what this means is that many people are struggling with greater depression and anxiety because they feel that there is no real hope for the future, that there is nothing beyond this life, that this is the only life that we have. And so this has been kind of predicted for decades, is that if we head down this path, people are going to lose hope. And many secularists were saying, no, we won't lose hope. And yet studies have now come out is actually that prediction has come true.
Yep.
That there are many people who are saying, if there is nothing beyond this life, and if this life is only geared towards greater pleasure, but if I can't get the pleasure that I crave, then what is the point of all of this? And so where he lands with that is that without God, our lives really are a mess. And so that's the thing that just really stood out to me, is like, this is why Jesus came, is to actually give our life purpose and meaning, because it's wrapped up in this relationship that we have with God. So without that, our lives begin to unravel. And I just really want to focus in on that, of why being led by Jesus is such good news for our souls. Because it actually... It's not just that it will give you a better marriage, or as a church that will lead us into having the right programs. It's that it actually satisfies a craving that our souls actually desire above everything else, is to be in relationship with him.
Yep.
I love that. It kind of that point that you were talking about just now, but also in your message, it made me think of the same kind of something similar you said, Kirk, about Harvard. And I know it was used in it for a different point.
Yep.
But when you were talking about the Harvard stuff and how it used to be, was it an actual Bible college, or was it just...
No, it's university.
It was a university, but it was a Jesus-centered university.
Yep.
And then your point was that they got caught up, but it just made me think about that, like how the world can kind of think, no, we're not going to lose hope or whatever. And just sort of that area. And I realized that sounds like it made sense in my head, but I did want to know, like, it's somewhat connected to a question that I kind of had for Kirk, that was that you can't, my question was, obviously you are saved or you're not, but can a person have neutral views towards God? Because when you were talking about this, you were sort of saying that, Colossians was telling you that you were looking at it a certain way. You're like, what? I was doing that, even though you weren't like hostile. Yeah, but you can't be neutral.
You can't be neutral towards God. It's impossible, because God when God created all of creation, including you and I, is created to be worshipers of God. So you are either worshiping him or you are not worshiping him. There is no like middle ground in that. Like somebody or something is the center of your life, is the center of your story.
Yeah.
And so even if you live in a space where you go, yeah, I just don't even think about God. That doesn't mean you're neutral.
Yeah.
It means that you are worshiping somebody other than God. And from God's perspective, it actually then, I mean, the Bible uses strong language in some parts of scripture. It talks about how we were enemies of God. That's strong language, right? Like we like the warm and fuzzy of we are God's children and we're forgiven and we're reconciled, and those things are true. But part of what makes something good news is when you understand how bad the bad news is.
Right. Yeah.
And the bad news is we were enemies of God because we weren't worshiping him. We thought we could do life on our own. We thought we didn't need him. And then by his grace, he shows us a different story. And so, yeah, you can't be neutral when it comes to God.
I guess maybe some might think that you can just because they're viewing it from like a very human stance, right? Like you can be neutral about another person, but you're not, that doesn't have to do with worship. Right. It's different because it's where your values are, where your worship is.
Yeah. There's a book that came out a couple years ago called Apathy, and it actually addresses this issue that most people are not outright hostile in their views of God. They actually, if you talk to someone on the street, they would say that they're more or less apathetic towards Christianity. Like they don't hate Christians. They're just, I don't even think about it. And the whole point of the book is to actually prove that apathy is actually a big issue.
Right.
Like it's actually not as neutral as we would like it to think, because like God is actually worthy to be worshipped, and anything less is treason towards the one true king. And so to be apathetic is something that we actually have to address.
Maybe it comes from, and this is a hypothesis, but like maybe it comes from a worship of comfort, because if you're apathetic, you don't have to get uncomfortable. Just a theory.
I think it'd be part of it, but I don't think that's necessarily the case for everyone.
No.
Right? But I think that can certainly be.
Sure.
We all have idols. Like every human has had or does have an idol in their life. And anything you're worshiping other than God means God's not the center of your story.
So let's talk about that, but maybe not necessarily worship, because you kind of called us into question some of the things in our lives that even that we're doing at church. Church is good, right? But we can get caught up in other things. Maybe not necessarily in a worship sense. Is that maybe accurate to say that? So a question would be for someone who's feeling convicted about being caught up in other things, and maybe you can explain to those that didn't hear your message what you meant by that. For someone who's feeling convicted about being caught up in other things and forgetting that church isn't all about Jesus, how can they get uncaught? Or unstuck, since I know uncaught is not a word.
Yeah, I mean, I talked a bit about the idea that like we all have reasons why we come to church. And, most of those reasons are good reasons. Like you want to go to church because you've got friends there, or because you want your kids to get some religion, or, they're not bad reasons. But the problem is too many times those reasons become our ultimate reasons. So the second that, the church loses their kids ministry leader, and so the kids program isn't as good as it was last week, then we're going, maybe I shouldn't go to this church. All right. So now we've made that the ultimate reason for church.
Yeah.
And the truth is the church only exists because of Jesus. It was his idea in the first place. None of us would come up with this idea on our own. He created the church. He sustains the church. He loves the church. And we get all these other ideas of, what success looks like in church and how many programs do we have and all that stuff. So how do you get unstuck? You have to constantly be asking yourself the question, is this ultimately what Jesus calls the church to be? Is this the thing? Is this the hill to die on?
Right.
Right. And so I talked at length about a few things that, how do you know if you're a church led by Jesus? One of the first things I talked about was, you're led by Jesus when Jesus is the one who determines the mission of the church. So, if if the church was calling you to give up your friendships so that you could pursue more people coming to faith in Jesus, are you prepared to do that? Because Jesus kind of did when he sent out all of his disciples. Instead of letting his disciples just hang out together all the time, he sends them out and disperses them all over the place to go and make more disciples. Right? That's a sign of being led by Jesus. Are you going to be serious about the mission that Jesus gives to us as a church? Honestly, like the things that the reasons most of us go to church, they're not only good reasons, they are like life-giving. Like they are for me. They are beneficial to me. But so much of what Jesus calls us to is about sacrificing, giving up our lives. And what are you pursuing? So, I just think that there's just this constant need to evaluate, are we making things that are secondary, important, but secondary, are we making them ultimate? And what are we sacrificing by making those things ultimate?
So calling into question, you were saying sort of getting unstuck by questioning what the mission of that Jesus has called us to.
Yeah, you have to constantly ask and this is it's both a corporate issue as a church, and it's also a personal issue for each individual and for each family to be able to say, like, what is driving my participation in a church? Is it Jesus or is it just my own comfort?
Right. Yeah, and if you're questioning that, if you're stuck and then you're asking that question, you'll see, or if you're caught up and you're asking that question, it'll surface.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very uncomfortable question, but the reason why we keep calling people in this church to be growing as disciples of Jesus is because at the end of the day, that is the mission Jesus has given us. There is not anything, everything else is secondary. This is the thing that matters most.
Yeah. And Daryl, you told us something similar to that. You told us or challenged us to remind ourselves of who we are in Christ. And you said daily. What does it mean or look like to do that, to remind ourselves of who we are in Christ daily?
Yeah. I think the way in which we do that, it can come out in different ways. Like all of this I can put it under the heading of spiritual disciplines, put it underneath that heading. Okay. Where I know that we just had a women's class that really did a deep dive into that. And we'll have other classes about that in the future where we need certain things in our lives, such as the practice of prayer, the practice of studying God's word, that these are the ways in which we on a daily basis are allowing Jesus to be leading us and to be guiding us. And so I think we need to pursue these disciplines with that in mind, that it's not just merely to pray. I know we just did a series on this, a very short series
called Prayer. Go back, forwardchurch.ca.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about prayer again soon because that was a short series. There's a lot more we could talk about because like how important that is, that not just that we pray or that we pray every day or that we have the right words to pray, but our prayer is so that Jesus would be guiding and leading us.
Yep.
That is the hope. So I don't care if you pray using the King James language. If that's just how it comes out, that's how it comes out. Or if you pray where you say, "Hey God," like I don't care like how you pray necessarily in that language type of thing. Scripture gives us lots of freedom of how we approach God, but it's that God, we're asking that God would guide and lead us. And so in the same thing, like it's not just a good practice to be studying the word, but to be studying it with that lens of what does the word have for me. So I'm being led by the Spirit. I'm being led by God in my day-to-day life. And so there's that aspect. And then to have the discipline to start matching up what is going on in our lives with those practices. And so I think that what we often do is we separate those two things. We'll go through the practice. We'll pray. We'll read scripture. We'll, whatever it is, we'll worship in the cars. We're driving into work, but we won't necessarily be connecting that to the issues of life.
That's right.
And that's the thing that is really hard work for us to connect the issues of life, of the struggling relationship or your relationship with God. And then you read a passage, like so let's say you're going to read through, Colossians chapter 2. What does that have to say about what is actually going on in your life? And again, it goes back to this. We are so hardwired to look after ourselves and our own securities that we create this barrier between these two things of spending time with God and taking care of my own business.
Yep.
And so what we need is the Holy Spirit to tear down that wall so that God will actually be the one who is affecting our lives on that daily basis. And that's challenging, right? That's why we have equip classes and discipleship groups is because we know we need to be working with each other to continually to be reminding ourselves of how do we go about doing this. It's something that's an ongoing process for ourselves.
And it's so important because if you've come to the Christian faith because you're looking for God to fix every problem in your life, you're going to end up sadly disillusioned and disappointed. Because he's not going to fix every single problem in your life. Not everything is going to be exactly the way you dream or imagine it's going to be. And living the kind of life like what Daryl's talking about here and pursuing Christ in the everyday of life, it's the kind of thing that's going to help you make sense of suffering. It's going to help you be able to be focused and be able to not just like cry out to God. And nothing wrong with crying out to God and asking him to change the suffering and the circumstances that you're in. But you read the New Testament, and this is a group of people that constantly are living in stages of suffering. And people like Paul are like, hey, I'm glad to suffer because it's a chance for me to become more like Christ. What they understood is that the whole of the Christian life was about becoming more like Christ. That is the aim and the goal. And I think too many times we've been one with a gospel that says, follow Jesus and he'll just make everything better for you. And that's just not the actual gospel. That's not, that is a less than full picture of what the gospel is and what God calls us to. So this is so essential that we get this right, that what the Christian life is about being conformed more and more into the image of Jesus.
Matt Chandler, he put it a really helpful way. He described it this way, that we need all of God for all of life.
Yeah.
I love that.
So we need all of God for all of life.
Yeah.
I like that because it connects your point about reading your Bible and relating it to you and your life. Because in my head, I had voices from other people being like, no, the Bible is about God, not you. But it's like that what you just said kind of connects it. The more of God you get, the more you see him in your life, right?
It is all about God, but it's God in your life.
Yes.
Right.
There should be no separation.
No.
Right.
God's over here, my life's over here.
Yeah.
We need all of God for all of life.
Yeah.
That is what we're getting at when we talk about being a church led by Jesus, that we need all of God to be leading all of our lives as a church.
Yep.
So we're a church led by Jesus. So you told us some common ways, Kirk, that people measure the success of a church. Not really sure if, so some examples you gave was like numbers of attendance, right?
Yep. How many people are at church on Sunday morning? How many programs are you running?
Yeah.
How many seats are in your auditorium?
How many seats are in your auditorium? Do you have enough parking spots?
How good's your coffee in the morning?
That's not a question. I'm not worried about that question.
No, you're not worried at all. Yeah. Mudwater. Anyway, so those are like some tangible measurements, right? Wondering though, the success of a church would be, is it led by Jesus? Is there like, well, you know what? Let me just read the question. Are there even measurable ways? What are the ways to measure a successful church?
Yeah, it is a big question, and it is a difficult question to answer because on some levels there are things that you can't measure.
Right.
There are things that you can measure, but even then, to use those as a definition of success can be misleading.
Yeah.
So, for instance, you can measure the number of baptisms. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't tell you the story of whether or not your church is engaged in planting seeds of the gospel. Right? And the Bible tells us that, sometimes you're just planting seeds and other people are going to water and other people are going to get to experience the growth. And so if all you're doing is measuring baptisms and you go, well, we baptized this many people this year, so that means we're successful. maybe.
Yeah.
But maybe you're just riding off the coattails of everybody else who's been planting seeds of the gospel.
Yeah.
And you're just getting the fruit.
So is the take home like, don't worry about measuring it?
No, there are things that you need to try to measure just to get a sense. So I'll give you an example of what one thing we do here. I mean, first of all, we measure everything. Honestly, we do. We measure like so.
I used to have to build the annual reports when I worked here.
We
They're
measure,
the worst.
We measure. Well, that doesn't even give a full taste of everything we measure now. So we measure so many things, but those things just tell us a bit of a story. They don't tell us whether or not we're successful or not.
Yeah.
But every year for the last few years, we've been doing a spiritual health survey, and we'll be doing one again coming up in a few weeks in October. And it's not a measurement of success as much as it's a picture of the spiritual health of our church congregation. And since the Christian life is ultimately about being fruitful, it gives us a little bit of a picture of how are we doing at being fruitful as God's people. And so we were just talking about it this morning, actually, as a leadership team. This survey is not a picture of are we being a success or not. It's just meant to give us a snapshot of who is forward today. Where are we thriving? Where are we struggling in our discipleship journey? And just gives us a little bit of a kind of a compass to help point us in a direction of some things that we can work on in our church. So, that's one example, but it is very difficult when you're talking about the spiritual state of people. It's very difficult to measure that.
Yeah.
I think that's sometimes the way that we would like to measure things. In many ways, it's kind of like a kid who goes up and like kind of measures how tall they are at the door. I don't know if you've ever done that. Like, and then they go back like the next day and like, have I grown?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, like, give it time. And then you look back over all of these years, like, wow, I've really grown. I've seen this. And I think in the same way as a church, like this is why we're doing the spiritual health survey year over year, so we can see the trajectory. The reason why we measure everything is because we want to see the story. We want to be, part of it is we want to be good stewards of the resources that we have. So that's why, when we get someone like Rob, who's like measuring, how much like resources we use for like soap and stuff. He's like, because we need to know how much we're spending on the stuff in our church. And like, that's a really good metric to have just for sake of stewardship, financially, but all of these things. But I think it tells a story, like, and that's what I love about hearing like the history of Forward. It's like, tell me about what happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 80 years ago as a church. And you begin to see this story, and it takes so much time to begin to see this, even in our own lives. Like we were talking about the survey on in our leadership meeting today, and I was saying I would love for people to take the survey from this that we're gonna have in a few Sundays, and hopefully people still have this in their inbox. The survey that they did 2 or 3 years ago, and then just compare it and take that into like a discipleship group setting. Everyone just bring in your data and just start asking like, how, like, now we actually have some answers here. Like how have you been growing, and seeing like, I'd even notice that my attitude towards God has changed for better or for worse.
Right.
And I don't even notice that my relationship with people outside of the church has gotten better or whatever it is. And again, it's that slow change. And again, it tells the story, and we can begin to ask God to be working in those situations. Yeah.
And you can almost see when you do that kind of thing, you can see the Lord's hand when it was like in the aftermath, right? Like when you're looking back, you can see that his hand, he was at work in the mountains, but also the valleys and all that.
I think if you were to look at this from a perspective of like, again, if Jesus is going to lead us, we can have a bit of an idea of how Jesus measures success. So if you go to the parable of the talents, for example, in the parable of the talents, Jesus says the exact same thing to every single person who invested their talents. He only says one thing really negative to the person who hid the talents.
Okay.
And so the whole point in that parable, or not the whole point, but part of the point in that parable is Jesus is looking at, the master is looking at these people who he's entrusted talents to. Those people go and invest what God's entrusted to them. And as they invest it, it gets multiplied and more happens. So the key question is, are you being faithful with what God's entrusted to you? Or are you hiding what God's entrusted to you? Are you keeping it to yourself? Are you doing things intentionally to try to multiply what God has entrusted to you? If you're being faithful with what God has entrusted to you, that is the measurement of success. That in that story, that is where Jesus shows up, the master returns, and he says, well done, good and faithful servant. And honestly, at the end of the day, I don't think Jesus is going to ask any of us, how many people did you average on Sunday morning in church? He's not going to ask us, how many programs did you run? He's not going to ask you any of those kinds of things. What he's going to look at is, what did you do with what I gave to you? I gave you this, I gave you these gifts. I gave you these people in your life. I gave you all these resources. What did you do with that?
Yeah.
Did you multiply that for my kingdom? Did you invest in that for my kingdom purposes to see it multiplied out? And if you did, that's where you end up in the space where the master says to you, well done, good and faithful servant.
I love that. That kind of sets us up for the next question, which I just thought of, and I didn't list it on your list. I know Kirk's like,
she's going to blindside us.
no, you never read the questions
You're right,
anyway,
I
Kirk.
You're right, I don't.
Daryl's starting to sweat though.
Going off script.
Before I do though, when you were talking about like budgets and stuff like that, I was going to ask Kirk, did you know that Daryl loves budget meetings? Did you know that about Daryl?
Daryl does not.
He loves budget meetings. Go ahead, tell him.
Yeah, budget meetings. Yeah,
He
they're
thinks
great.
they're fun.
Yeah.
I almost slapped him when I heard that.
So I'm going to let Daryl run a budget meeting, and then he can
do
find out
it.
how much he likes budget meetings.
Yeah, I bet. No, let's. It's true though. He did tell me that. We're gonna take this curveball question because you're talking about using the gifts, right?
Yep.
For the church, for the mission. So my question. This is risky because I don't actually have the wording figured out, but just bear with me. So if Jesus has called us as a church to a mission, is it the same mission for every church? Because you also talked about seeds and watering. Do churches have a one general mission, but maybe different other missions or jobs? Like, tell us more about that.
Yeah, every church does ultimately have the same mission.
Okay.
Jesus told us what the mission is.
Yeah.
He said, go and make disciples.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, that is our mission.
That's
Now,
the
you might use different language and different
Sure.
words to pretty it up between different churches, but honestly, at the core of it, that is the thing that should be one of our unifying factors across all churches.
Yeah.
But what that looks like might be different from
Okay.
church to church,
Okay.
like how that plays out. So, there are some churches where they are in neighborhoods, they're located in neighborhoods that are low income neighborhoods. And so what it looks like to go and make disciples in a low income neighborhood is going to look different than it might in a neighborhood like where we're located
Sure.
in as a church. I mean, we have low income neighborhoods near us, but they're not all low income neighborhoods. So how you live out the mission might be different.
I like that. That makes
and that's
sense.
where you contextualize it. And even between Forward, Kitchener, and Cambridge, there are, we share the same mission, we share the same core values and beliefs, and we share a lot of things between our two sites. And Ingersoll too, between our three sites, we share a lot of things in common, but there's also a lot of things that are very contextualized. There are things we do in Ingersoll we don't do in Kitchener, and things we do in Kitchener we don't do in Cambridge. And even when we're doing the same thing, we might do it in a different way in that particular location. So because you're trying to contextualize the mission to the needs of the people that are there. So yeah, absolutely. But every church does have, at the core, we all have the same mission.
Just looks different.
Just looks different.
I love that. It makes me think about many preliminary conversations we had when you first got here, Daryl, when I was on staff at Kitchener. And I think I would say to you, we often try to do the same things at Kitchener of a congregation of 130 at the time. Well, maybe even less, more like 80 because it was like COVID. And in a very different type of community.
Yeah.
And I think we were conversing a bit about how it doesn't always work the same way.
That's the challenging part about contextualizing is that to contextualize the gospel for where you're at, it is a very challenging thing to do. But it's good that we pursue that because as Kirk just said, we're in different neighborhoods. And so, every church is going to view that differently. And no, I was even just reflecting on what you said, that, for some people they're individually, the role is to plant, some is to water, some to reap the harvest. And so I would even say for some ministries that they might experience that as well, that there might be a faithful church in an area that just is planting seeds and just isn't seeing any fruit from it. And then another church in the area ends up, reaping the fruit. But I mean, like, both are part of the same mission. It just so happens that they're playing different roles within all of that. So I think I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say it goes beyond just the individual. It can be the church gathering as well can experience that. And I've seen that of a church that's been struggling. It's not that they have abandoned the mission. It's just that they might be having a different role that they're playing in that area. But anyways, that would be a longer conversation about that. But
another podcast. It could also, though, you could say, we could take it even further, talking about like the variations of the definition of what a disciple is, like in regards to the main mission. Like we've kind of talked about this. We have.
And I mean, one of the things so this is just me getting irritated.
It's time for irritated Kirk.
That's right. Well, one of the things that gets me irritated is that when churches start to define disciples as being, well, we've got this many people in small groups, so therefore we've got this many disciples. And I'm like, that's just not true. It's not what it means to be a disciple at the end of the day. Groups are a means to an end, but they are not the end. A disciple is someone who looks more and more like Jesus.
I like that.
That's the bottom line. The whole point of what God's doing in our life, what God is saved. The Bible uses 3 tenses to talk about salvation. You have been saved, you are being saved, you will be saved. And we're in this you are being saved kind of phase if you're a Christian right now, which means every day God's doing something to sanctify you, to make you a little bit more and more like Jesus. It's his work in your life, and you just have to surrender and allow him to lead you and shape you more and more into the image of Jesus.
I really want to just take that rabbit trail because I have like 10 more questions that I could think of, but it's a little off topic of our church led by Jesus. So I'll save it for another day. I don't want to irritate Kirk anymore. But what I will say is I want to wrap it up here, but I listened to the podcast last week and I got rudely interrupted by my children. So I didn't hear the very end. Did you guys get a chance to talk about the pamphlet that was handed out in regards to the Equip class?
Yeah.
You did talk about it?
We did. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you want to add to that? Because if you don't have a pamphlet, we have Equip classes coming up. You can find them on our website, right? forwardchurch.ca.
Yes, go to our events page.
Any encouragement for the congregation in signing up?
The only thing that I would say is, again, we don't want you to look at this as a long list of just programs and activities. It's about being discerning about where God wants you to connect in to help you grow in your discipleship. Some of you are in a spot where you don't need to go to a class. You need to get some counseling. And there's just some stuff going on in your life and you need some counseling assistance. Some of you need to get baptized. Like you've not been baptized. Your next step of following Jesus is get baptized. By the way, you don't need to pray about it. Just say yes. It's just do it.
Yeah.
And I've actually had interactions with a few people in the last couple of days who have said to me, hey, but I feel really anxious getting up in front of a whole bunch of people. And so like, talk to us about that. Don't let that be your barrier for baptism. Talk to us. We love you. We want to help you be obedient to Jesus. That's what matters most.
Yeah, you've been pretty open about your anxieties towards not crowds, because it'd be hard to be a pastor if you were. But water, yes. So if Kirk can do it, guys, you can do it. That's awesome. Is there anything else that you want to? I mean, there was one thing I was going to mention too. Like, I'll give you guys the table to say the last few words to your congregation, or your listeners, I guess I should say. You mentioned a little bit, you had a little sidebar in your message, Kirk, about parenting.
Yep.
Wondering if Forward has parenting resources or outside resources that you recommend?
Yeah, so if you go to the website, go to the kids section on the website or the family section on the website, and you will see a whole bunch of resources, whether you have kids or whether you have youth. There are some links to some great resources to help you out as a parent. And if you need more help, talk to Neil or talk to Kristen, who head up our kids ministry in Cambridge and Kitchener, and they would be more than happy to help you out.
Neil M at forwardchurch.ca and Kristen C at forwardchurch.ca.
Who, shout out to our kids ministry team. They do an awesome work.
They work so hard.
Love what they do.
They're amazing. I don't think I could do what they do. Oh, I think I corrected myself last time I said that. I know I couldn't do what they did. Okay, next week we're talking a church of contributors, Philippians 2:1-8. So I'm looking forward to diving in further. But I want to leave the microphone with the pastors to say the last few words to your listeners before we say farewell. Before we say it, you have like 1 second to think about it.
All right, go ahead, Bill.
Or else I'll just say farewell.
All right. I'll end it the same way I ended on Sunday. To be led by Jesus means that Jesus is actually going to start directing your path. And that's my hope for our listeners today, is to be praying and asking God, like, what is the next step that they know that God is leading them in, that God would reveal that to them. And that's why we need to talk about that brochure. I hate calling it a brochure, but it's what it is.
What would you rather call it? Is there
I think of it as a disciple.
Don't ask.
Is there a King James version of brochure?
God has not called Daryl to the marketing world.
We figured that out pretty quickly.
We've had this conversation before.
Hey, do you want a pastor or a marketer? Which one do you want? Can't get both of me.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, that's true. We want a budget person, Daryl.
Daryl comes up with titles for classes, and I just look at him and roll my eyes.
Oh, man, I'd love to hear some of those.
The wrong answer's only for that one.
Okay.
But I think of it as a discipleship tool. Like, it's not just events and classes. It's something that's actually meant to guide us, lead us into greater discipleship. But this whole idea of being led by Jesus, I just really want it to move from just being this good idea. It sounds lovely that we are a church led by Jesus, but what it actually means is that you're going to start making decisions based upon what Christ is telling you. It means that it's going to impact your relationships and your finances and like everything in your life to be led by him. And it means being in a vulnerable state where we're allowing God to guide us into places that are uncomfortable. I talked about this on Sunday that, in the, if you read about the Navy SEALs, that they go through intense training so that they can trust the people beside them, but trust primarily their leader. So when he calls them into tough territory, that must be the direction I have to go, because he's calling me to run through that door. And so I'm going to go and do that because I trust the person who's calling me. And that's where we need to see God as our good father. He is our shepherd who wants to guide you into the best life for you. And that might mean challenging situations because it is best for you and for your discipleship journey in becoming more like Christ. And so that's where I'm asking, like, take some time this week and think through, what is the next step for you this week? I don't know what that is, but it could be jumping into a class or jumping into biblical counseling. I don't know what that is, but we need to make sure that Jesus is actually directing our next steps.
I love that. Anything else to add, Kirk?
It's tough to add much more to that.
Yeah.
I think that's a great summary and great challenge coming out of this message. I just want to say that for those of you who particularly engage online with our Forward Cambridge site each week, this coming Sunday, we have a little surprise for all of you. And you will find out on Sunday morning, but it's going to be a little bit different than normal.
So do you mean like the church at home people?
Yep. All the people who are church at home, who join us each week or are planning on joining us this week online, we have a little surprise for those who connecting with the Cambridge service.
My mind is racing. Is it a viral video of somebody dancing on staff?
Definitely not.
Is it?
Definitely not.
Is it shooting confetti out of cannons?
We already did that last Sunday night.
Which I'm sure our custodial staff loved.
Yeah.
As soon as I saw the videos going off on Sunday night of all the I had all these people posting videos on my Facebook feed
of the confetti.
Jeremy Camp concert, right?
Yeah, Jeremy Camp.
And like the first song, he's got confetti shooting, like streamers shooting everywhere. I'm like, oh, that's gonna be.
And then Rob was on your door going, I need a
mess.
raise.
Yeah, pretty much.
I had to walk through the auditorium on Monday just to see what it looked like, and
It was a mess.
it looks much better today.
Yeah,
much better today.
You know, there was a season in life when I would have been like, this is fun. And then I had kids, and now every time I see a mess, I'm like,
Yeah, that's how you know you're in your mid-30s.
Yeah.
Is we view messes different now.
there you go. This is #real life. If you can think of a better name for our brochure, we will provide you with a prize. You can send your answers to
We who?
Kirk.
We who?
I got some prizes.
All right.
Confetti. All right. That was the Forward Rewind podcast. We are Forward Church. Roar. Tune in next week.